Stories influence, teach, and inspire us. But what about the storytellers who create them? Uncorking a Story profiles storytellers to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. It all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin? Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Now here's your host, Mike Carlin.
Well, hello and welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today I'm pleased to introduce you to Merle Saferstein. As the Director of Educational Outreach at the Holocaust Documentation and Education Center for 26 years, Merle worked closely with hundreds of Holocaust survivors, helping them pass along their legacy of remembrance to hundreds of thousands of students and teachers. Here today to talk about her life and book entitled Living and Leaving My Legacy, Volume 1 is Merle Saferstein. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Merle.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
I couldn't be more delighted to have you here. And I'm going to ask you the same question I ask everybody. First one out of the gate is always, Merle, tell me, where does your story begin?
So my writing story begins when I was a little girl. I was about 9 years old, and I was writing to family all over the country. And I remember saying to myself, I need to lead an interesting life in order to have something to write about. And so that began, and it was really letter writing for many, many years. And then in 1974, I started journaling, and then the rest is history. I've been journaling ever since. I've written a few books, only one of which has been published, and now this one. So my journey has been writing, but I've also been an educator my entire life. And so that's really been my primary focus.
Tell me, what was going on in 1974 that prompted you to start journaling?
So my husband and I had moved from Cleveland, Ohio to Florida, and we had two little children. They were 18 months apart. And I was taking a course, I was taking actually a gestalt course, and we had to keep a notebook. And when the course finished, I had this stenographer's pad. God only knows why I bought that, but it had empty pages. And my 30th birthday, I just started reflecting on what was going on in my life at the time. And I opened up that notebook and started writing. And that was the beginning of my journaling. And I also, because we were fairly new to South Florida, I didn't know a lot of people. And I was feeling the need to talk to someone. And so my journal became that someone.
Very cool. Tell me, what's the Gestalt course? Is that based on Gestalt psychology or?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, my husband started going to the gym because he felt like he needed some adult company, and I started taking classes. So I took sculpting, I took stained glass window making, and then I took transactional analysis, which was TA. I'm okay, you're
Sure.
okay.
Oh, I remember that was Scott Harris. Was that Scott Harris?
No.
No. Okay.
I don't remember who it was. And then Gestalt was Fritz Perls. And so I actually took that class with someone who had trained under Fritz Perls. So that was pretty exciting. And that's how that began.
Yeah, no, I'm going back to my undergraduate days because psych was my major, and I was gonna go on to get a PhD in clinical psychology. And I remember, reading. I remember reading "I'm Okay, You're Okay." Then I remember reading like "Man's Search for Meaning" by Viktor Frankl, which is a powerful book. To this day, I've never forgotten that book. But do you remember if Frankl was a Gestalt psychologist? Was he involved in the Gestalt movement?
I don't remember that. I do know he was a psychologist. And I too, that was a book that we read and recommended it when I was a Holocaust educator. That was a really important book. And I've probably read it about 5 or 6 times myself. But when I was in college, I was an education major. My sophomore year, so this was in the early 60s, in my sophomore year, I called home and told my parents I wanted to become a psychologist. And my mother said, oh no, you need to be a teacher because you'll always have a job. As if being a psychologist, I wouldn't. And in those days, we didn't question what our parents said, at least I certainly did. And so I became an educator instead.
Yeah, no,
And found other ways to do psychology.
Oh, without a doubt. I just remember like the early 60s, kind of a golden age of psychology here in the United States anyway. The behaviorist movement was kind of in full swing, and social psychology was about to ramp up with Philip Zimbardo and all the studies he did at Stanford, kind of going into the 70s. It was some really innovative work that probably wouldn't be able to get done today. Some of it was controversial. Well, tell me a little bit about getting involved with the Holocaust Documentation and Education Center.
So I had been asked by a friend of mine who I actually met at Hollywood Beach, which you might know Hollywood Beach well. I met this man who eventually became the director of the Anne Frank Center in New York. He had been a priest. He had left the priesthood. He was on his own journey, and he became the director. And so when he became director, someone in Germany had found the Anne Frank photo album in a chest of drawers and they recognized Anne Frank and sent it to the Amsterdam Center. The Amsterdam Center created an 800 photographic exhibition around Anne Frank and the Holocaust. So my friend Tom asked me if I would be interested in bringing the exhibit to Miami as the pilot city. So this was in 1985. I had quit my job and had actually written a book and was kind of lost. It was my midlife crisis. I was trying to figure out what to do. And Tom knew, as a writer, as someone who kept journals, and Anne Frank, knowing Anne Frank spoke to my soul, he figured this was a perfect fit. So I brought the exhibit to Miami. I did a lot of student programming around the exhibit and invited 2 women from the Holocaust Center to come speak at this one symposium we did for high school students. They liked what they saw. They asked me to come volunteer and help them with their educational programming. And so I did. And I went as a volunteer. Their secretary quit. They asked me if I would consider being a secretary. I said I will for 3 months, but after that, if I'm not doing education, then I'm out of here. And the rest is history. I stayed
Wow.
for 26 years and had really an incredible opportunity to work with probably 500 Holocaust survivors on a first name close basis.
Yeah, and I don't want to overlook that. I will come back to it, but you mentioned a midlife crisis book that you wrote. Tell me, I can't let it go. Tell me a little bit more about that. What was the book about, and why did you call it a midlife crisis book?
No, it was in my midlife crisis.
Yeah.
I was searching for myself. The book was in letter form. And had gone to a dinner party one night, and I was sitting next to this man who told me the story that he and his wife had been divorced, and then their close friend got cancer, and they both wanted to go visit her, and they didn't want to do it alone, so they went together. They fell back in love and remarried. It was at the same time that 3 of our closest sets of friends were getting divorced, and my husband and I were really having a hard time processing that. And so this was a happy ending, and I thought, oh, I can write a book using this story. So that's what I did. And I was really, at the time I was interviewing for jobs. I kept getting job offers and turning them away because I just knew I couldn't, I needed to be doing something else. I needed to find something that spoke to my soul. So in the interim, I wrote this book.
So it sounds like it was a piece of fiction?
It was fiction. Yeah.
Okay.
Fiction in letter form. And then it got picked up to be made into a movie.
No kidding.
And I'll never forget this. I went to New York. It was very exciting. The person who did the screenplay for Children of a Lesser God was doing the screenplay for the book. And then the person who was producing it decided to build a studio in Hungary and drop the whole project. But it didn't matter because the fantasy of just going to New York, I will never forget the day I went to New York and I was sitting with these 3 men and they're talking about the book, and it was so exciting to me. And I called home and my husband told me one of my kids got a progress report and something else was going on. And I thought, too bad. And I went back to the table. I thought, okay, I'd much rather be doing this.
Yeah, that's a great story. So many people never make it that far. So was the book ever published, or
No.
it was never published?
And that's okay. I did I did make copies, and my book club at the time read it, and I just found it fascinating. People were talking about my characters, that I had created in my mind. But that was several years later, and I reread the book before I did the book club. And I will never forget turning to my husband and saying, so is there anything that I left out of these characters, or of myself? Because every single character, even though I spent really weeks and months trying to develop characters and figuring out, their sun signs or what they would do and whatever, each one of them was really a part of me. And that was a really important learning lesson about writing.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. So, I mean, tell me just the emotional experience, having worked with and sort of interviewing so many Holocaust survivors.
So the experience for me, my job as an educator, was really to help them pass along their legacy to students and teachers. And so we did programs for 10 to 12 programs a year, from 250 to the last program was 850 kids, where 10 students sat at a table with a Holocaust survivor and had the opportunity to ask questions. And then we, talked about what happened to them as teenagers, and then what's happening to the kids in South Florida as teenagers, and the prejudice. And so it was really before bullying became popular, but it was basically understanding the lessons of the Holocaust. I was so privileged because I got to know these survivors well. And for me, what I learned was the resilience of the human spirit in a way that, for me, it was just an incredible opportunity. I'll never forget one time I was about late 40s, and the Holocaust survivors were in their 60s and 70s. And I went to a luncheon, and I was thinking, I can't even imagine what this is going to be like to be with these survivors at a luncheon. There was a band playing. These survivors got up, and I was like in a room full of teenagers. And I realized how they had really picked up the pieces from the ashes and had built their lives and lived full, incredible, wonderful lives. Of course, these are the survivors who were willing to talk about their experiences. I know there's survivors who were in their apartments, not talking to anyone about anything. But it was really such a blessing to be able to do this, a huge gift.
Yeah, geez, just thinking and kind of going back to Viktor Frankl for a minute, Man's Search for Meaning. I know he made the point that if you were able to find meaning in your suffering, in your circumstance, those are the, people who kind of made it. Who weren't, killed,
Right.
but who were able to kind of come out and then being able to find meaning after that. And I'm sure, the people who don't talk, we didn't call it anything PTSD back then, but that, oh my goodness, that, I can't imagine.
Well, the survivors definitely had nightmares, and when they would speak to the students, they'd very often say to me, I didn't sleep the night before, I didn't sleep the night after. And when a survivor would talk, basically he or she would talk and not cry until they started talking about when they said goodbye to their parents for the last time, their siblings. But what was really astonishing to me was the Liberators. So we also interviewed Liberators at our center. One particular event, we honored 4 different Liberators. And we had a session with these 4 men who were all in different parts of the Army and Navy, Air Force, actually. And they were talking about their experiences. They were young kids. They were 18, 19 years old, having no idea what was happening when they opened the gates and walked into living hell, really. It was the Liberators who said they never talked about the Holocaust until Holocaust denial started. And then they knew they had to, that they were the ones who were the witnesses, and that it was incumbent upon them to speak about it. And those Liberators were the ones who really suffered from PTSD, because they kept it for 20, 30 years before they even began to talk about it. And that's a long time to hold that in.
Yeah, I remember just reading, some stories about Liberators, and as you mentioned, sort of not knowing, there was no, lack of awareness of what really was happening, and them just not even being able to process or realize what they were seeing.
Right.
Gosh, I can't imagine. And that goes for, US, the Russians. Oof, I just kind of get a chill down my spine hearing you talk about it.
I know. There's so many stories too of survivors coming together after many, many years. I will never forget, I had survivors translating documents because we had a lot of documents in different languages. And Michael Birnbaum from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, he's the one in Washington who actually created the inner workings of the exhibit. Michael came to look at our memorabilia. And so I had survivors lined up that were going to meet with him. And while they were waiting, I had two of them translating documents for me. And I went out of the room and I came back to get one of them. And the two of them were standing and hugging each other. And why? Because they started talking and one realized that his parents were in the same ghetto as he was, and he stood up at his parents' wedding. I mean, it was just this coming together, and these guys had worked together. They had been in programs, but there were so many stories like that that were just bone chilling, just to hear how they came together.
Yeah, but that's why these, museums, these centers, these exhibits are so important, because it could happen again. Heaven forbid, but unless you document and remember it, history repeats itself. It could happen again.
And teach it. I mean, really, teach it and help the students understand what can happen.
Yeah. Well, tell me a little bit about the book, Living and Leaving My Legacy, Volume 1, and I assume that means there's a Volume 2 planned.
There's a Volume 2. So this book started because I've been keeping journals, like I said, since 1974. I have a collection currently of about 380 journals. But in 2002, I realized that I could not leave my journals to my children. I went through a whole process of should I, shouldn't I, whatever, and finally decided that no, I really wrote them for my eyes only. And so I wanted to leave something, and I, as an educator, kept thinking, at the time I had written, 300 and some journals, and said there's got to be something in these journals worth sharing, but I had no idea. But it kept recurring in my mind, like, what have I written? Because I would write them and literally put them in a safe that I keep in my house, a fireproof safe. So I decided to go back and start reading my journals, and I divided my life into 70 different topics and started taking excerpts. It was a long, crazy process. It took me 14 years to go through 359 journals, and then to take those journals and cull down the things I wanted to share. And so there were some topics that were 75 pages, some were 450 pages, that I eventually whittled down to around 30 pages per chapter. And I divided, I eliminated a lot of the chapters. So Volume 1 has 11 chapters and Volume 2 has 11 chapters. And they are all excerpts from my journals based on different subjects. So I do have some work on the Holocaust in there. I have parenting, marriage, and being a woman. So the women's journey from 1974 has really changed. I had become an ardent feminist, and so there's that whole thread. I have a chapter on spirituality. In Volume 2, I have a chapter that's called Those Who Are There. And what I did was I wrote about 30 vignettes of survivors' experiences, probably the most important writing that I've ever done, because that's really my promise to them, to keep their story alive.
What did you learn about yourself just by going through and those 359 journals you said? What did you learn? What insights into yourself did you uncover?
Well, I learned that one thing that I think for me was the most insightful and interesting was I always considered myself having lived a very positive life. I've always felt like I was a blessed soul. And if someone had asked me before doing this project, how much of your life is positive and how much is negative, I would have probably said 50-50. And at the end, what I realized was that it wasn't really so. That, everyone goes through tough times, good times, bad times. We, on a daily basis, we have all kinds of range of emotions. But what I learned was that because I journaled in the way that I did, when there was something negative, I worked through it to make it a positive, so that in general, my life feels positive. And so that was a really big thing that I learned. I saw how I grew. I especially loved when I would see where I planted a seed and then watched it grow into something. And I also learned what a huge gift that I'd given myself. So when I wrote this book, beyond realizing that I wanted to share it with more than just my children, what I really understood about this project and what I knew that I had to do, and after retiring from the Holocaust Center, I started teaching legacy classes, was that while I want people to read the book and it is about my life, it's really what I really want is for people to look at my life and then look at their own life. So use my life as a mirror, what resonates for them, and then to be able to understand that how we live our life becomes our legacy. And that's the real goal. That, and also to help people understand the power and the gift of journaling, because it really is. And so in the book, after each chapter, I have journal prompts, and then I have pages where people can actually answer the prompts if they want to write about them, but something to think about. So it becomes more interactive, and it's a huge book. It's very big. Look, and this is how big it is.
Oh my goodness, you're getting your money's worth.
Yeah, for sure. We priced it before we realized just how much it was going to cost.
Yeah, the shipping alone, I'm sure.
I had to order special envelopes. It weighs 2 pounds. When it came in the mail, I was shocked. It weighs 2 pounds. It's 8 by 10. It's an inch thick. I mean, it's big, but hopefully people will read it and understand the importance of how they're living their life, and helping people to live the best life they can.
Yeah. So, I mean, having not published your first novel, what was the publishing process like this? Like, how did you approach it? Did you go the traditional route and look for an agent, or how'd you do it?
Well, so I had written another book that I did publish after I left the Holocaust Center. I wrote a book of short stories about the Hollywood Beach Hotel, and that one I self-published. This one, so now I'm 77, and what I realize is that I mean, I have none of us have any idea how long we're going to live, but I want to be able to put this out in the world and have the experience of that. And so I was willing to self-publish if that were the case, but someone who's a hybrid publisher who's really basically just starting out, and someone that has worked with me in this cancer group that I volunteer doing a writing class, she asked me if I would be interested in her publishing it. So it's a hybrid press, and basically I worked with a graphic designer whom she had was part of her press, and the experience was absolutely incredible because the three of us really worked together. They just took this on as if it were their own, and the three of us just worked so beautifully together, and it was positive in every single way. One is a shaman, the publisher is a shaman, and so she had a lot to say about just in a different way of looking at the world. And the other one was also very spiritual. So they brought that element in, especially when Mercury came in retrograde, and also there was the big eclipse and things were going wrong. The three, and then they're telling me why, and I'm like, all right, whatever you say, just look.
Now, I noticed that there was a co-author, Kay Adams. Was she one of the three that you're talking about? Or?
No, she's not the co-author.
Okay.
She actually wrote the foreword. I'm not sure
Okay.
exactly why it's listed that way. So Kay is she's a journal therapist. She is noted in the journal world. Actually, in her, what I read on Google when I was I know Kay, but I just was looking up her bio. She was listed along with Anne Frank and Ananias Nin as one of the journaling gurus of the world. And
Oh, wow.
Jay, when Kay said she would write the forward, I was beyond thrilled because she really understood the value of journaling, and she explained it in just in a beautiful way.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that Kay Adams, if I have my Godfather history correct, was Michael Corleone's wife in The Godfather, and the character's name was Kay Adams, played by Diane Keaton, I believe, a young Diane Keaton.
Oh, wow. I have to
So there
tell
you go.
Kay that.
I'm sure she's probably heard it once or twice before.
Yeah, I would guess so. I would guess so.
Well, I do have a couple of fun questions here for you, which I always go through towards the end of our time together. The first one being kind of thinking back to your childhood. Some of your favorite television shows when you were growing up. What were some of those?
Okay, so I'm going to tell you two you probably have never even heard of because you were surely not born then. So one was I Remember Mama. It was, I remember going to my grandmother's house and watching it. And another one was I think it was Winky Dink. It was on, we put a screen, like a wax paper on our television, and we could draw Winky Dink's adventures. So that goes back a really long time ago. I'm talking in the 50s.
Yeah.
When television first came out and when we first got a TV. But as a teenager, a young teenager, Mickey Mouse Club.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Was something that we couldn't get home fast enough. In fact, one of my girlfriend's mothers would pick us up from school, so we would get to see the whole Mickey Mouse Club. So that was probably a show. And just to say that I hardly watched television for most of my life until the pandemic. And then I got really hooked. And my daughter to this day cannot believe that we're talking television shows. So,
what did you like during the pandemic? What caught your attention?
I'm totally hooked on This Is Us and A Million Little Things. I mean, those two shows, and also Offspring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those.
This Is Us. I watched the first season and it was just too heavy for me. Like I'm so like empathic. I couldn't take it. I felt a connection to all these characters, and the episode where you see the father die. I'm like, spoiler alert. But it was just too much. I couldn't watch it anymore, and I know it just wrapped.
Yeah.
But I know people love that show.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
I watched the second last one. My daughter's coming for my book launch event, and she asked me to please save the last one to watch with her. But she and my niece, who's a psychologist, and I have been texting through all throughout this whole thing. And A Million Little Things is also really an excellent show. So those are two now. There
you go. How about this? Favorite place you'd like to visit that you've never been to? Any place come to mind?
I always wanted to go to Holland to tip through the tulips. So I don't know that I'll get there, but that's one place I would like to go. I'd like to go to Iceland. I'd like to go to, I've got a very long list.
No, me too. I haven't been anywhere. I would love to go to Iceland. I would love to swim in the hot springs and then just see the sky, just to see that. Tiptoe to the tulips, though. Now, I have to pick up on that because if I remember, there was a guy named Tiny Tim.
Tiny Tim. Oh, yeah.
He used to sing Tiptoe Through the Tulips.
He did.
With his ukulele. And now that's going to be in my head for the rest of the day.
Right. Sorry.
No, that's okay. There's worse things that could be in my head.
That's true.
How about this? You've had a couple of different careers, explored a lot of interests. What's one career you'd like to pursue that you never have?
Probably being a psychologist.
Yeah.
Probably being a psychologist. And I have to say that I really have found ways to do that. I mean, people have always said to me, are you a psychologist? So in some way to be a therapist, but probably isn't going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, never say never. My niece just graduated with her. She's a licensed clinical social worker, or she's about to be licensed.
Right.
And which is basically being a psychologist, but without
Oh, sure.
the research part, right? So it's
Right.
all practical. And I look at her, I'm like, first of all, I'm so proud that she went in that direction. But there's I'd be lying if I didn't say there's a little bit of jealousy there, because that's the career path I wanted to have, and I don't see myself going back for a PhD anytime soon. I've got 3 kids in college, so that's that's just not
No,
happening.
I don't think so.
That's not happening. But I mean, these are kind of therapeutic therapy sessions for me sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've heard a few that you've gotten into stuff, which is great.
Yeah, I try. How do you feel when you're staring at a blank piece of paper and or a computer screen, depending on how you write, and your goal is to write something that day?
That is never an issue for me. I love nothing more than a blank piece of paper. As a journal writer, when I open up my journal, I have no idea. Once in a while, I might know what's going to come down, but very often I start writing and don't know and fill 4 pages, 5 pages, or whatever. So blank screens do not threaten me at all. And when I wrote the short stories, which was fiction, and I'm really not a fiction writer, I would say I was a little more intimidated, but I somehow found my way.
Yeah, no, I love that. I get so many different responses to that question. It's either I embrace it, I love it, nothing excites me more than the possibilities of the canvas I'm about to paint, to scared to death, anxiety, don't know what I'm going to write, want to do everything but write. And then they write the first paragraph and it's off to the races. But how about this? Having just published this book, what lesson about publishing, if any, do you feel like you learned the hard way?
It's been such a positive experience for me that I don't really think, I think that probably just to trust in the universe, and just go with the fact that this is going to all come out okay. And so, for example, on my pub date, it was supposed to be June 7th, but in order to get books published get books for my publicist, I had to ask for books. I had to order books, and they considered April 28th is my pub date, which just totally blew my mind because that's not what was happening. So we had to take the book off and get a new ISBN number and start all over again so that we can have June 7th as the pub date. So that was a lesson, just we needed to do more research than we had done.
Yeah. One observation I'll make is, you partnered with this hybrid publisher and you worked, with 2 other people to kind of really bring it to life. And, one of the lessons I can point out there is that this is not something you can really do alone.
Right.
You need to, it's always great to have someone to collaborate with. Probably good to have a shaman on hand too.
That helped. That was great. But also I have a few friends who are authors who really held my hand, and that's helpful too. And you're right. I mean, you can't write a book by yourself, I don't think. I mean, maybe some people do, but I have quite a village behind me, and I'm so grateful.
Yeah, there is an importance to community. The writing part can be sort of a solo activity, but as you're putting it all together, getting up to launch, post-launch, like being part of a writing community, I think is very helpful, because they'll tell you things that you won't learn otherwise, and they can be more objective too than maybe friends or family.
Yeah. Before we went on air, we were talking. You mentioned that you'd done focus groups. So what I did with my book was I had probably 30 people read it, and then I divided them. I gave them 2 dates and said, we're going to do a Zoom session and I want to hear feedback. And it was really like a focus group. It was so fascinating to me to do it that way. And to, and I did get individual feedback too, but to then have the conversation about the book. And it was a great experience. So I recommend that.
That's helpful. It's also, you've got to be very vulnerable when you do something like that, because the feedback sometimes can be critical. So, and you have to be open to kind of hearing some criticisms.
So
that's important.
You talk vulnerability. I mean, this book is my life. I am putting out there. When my daughter read it, she called me up and she said, "Mom, here's a list of things that a child should never have to read about their parents." So I mean, there's a lot of vulnerability. Also, the question of self-doubt, like, why would I think that my life is worth anyone reading about? And what is this all about? And so I think that that's a really big piece of this, is the vulnerability. And I think most authors go through that at some point.
Yeah. I mean, I think most authors have imposter syndrome. Regardless of how big their name is in the industry, there's always that lingering feeling, am I good enough to do this? Why would people want to read something I did? But that's, you got to get over it. You have to get over imposter syndrome. Right. And if you can give your younger self some words of advice, if you can give, that maybe that going back to 74, when you first started journaling, you certainly weren't a child back then, but if you could whisper some words of advice into that younger woman's ear, what would you tell her?
To stay in the moment, to be present, and to understand that things will happen for a reason. And like I had said before, trust in the universe. I think, those are lessons that took me a while to learn, but I think journaling has really helped me stay in the present. Yeah.
Any launch events coming up that people can attend or look into?
Yeah, so I do have a launch event on June 12th in South Florida, which is on my website. And I also am planning to do 1 or 2 virtual launch events, and I will post those on my website as well.
Very cool. And the website address would be what?
Would be MERLERSAFERSTEIN.com. So MERLESaferstein.com.
Well, and I will be sure to put those in the show notes so people don't have to write it down in their cars as they're listening to this. So we make sure we'll have those links there. Any social media you want to talk about?
Yes, it's all on my website. All the social media is on my website as well.
So we will point people there. Of course, the book is Living and Leaving My Legacy, Volume 1. The author is the lovely Merle Saferstein. Thanks so much for joining me today, Merle. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, really. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.